Look, everyone knows that the Santa Claus story is just a linguistic concoction that is publicized to influence the behavior of children. Parents could simply say to their kids instead, "Hey, do what I tell you, and I will give you some presents that you will like. But if you misbehave, or rebel, or bug me, then you won't get as many presents, or the ones you asked for." 16,000 times. It's a classic case of bribery first, and of fraud only secondarily. It directs the attention of the children to a future reward, a possible future reward, and teaches them discipline. Sure, the Santa myth involves some trickery, and since it is pretty popular, we can assume that it has worked well enough to keep the story popular for however long so far. It is also manipulative, deceptive, and dishonest. So, why would we expect something much different from social institutions and their PR campaigns? Governments govern people, right? They implement rewards and punishments, along with using organized violence like cops and armies and jails. Governments concoct myths and propaganda to influence behavior. They promote their agendas through public schools and the media. Governments redistribute wealth. They take from some groups and give to other groups. They take from some groups, like taking Texas away from Mexico in the middle of the 19th century by force, and give to other groups, like for building roads and building weapons of mass destruction, and to pay for the elderly to get expensive pharmaceutical drugs that suppress their functioning of their immune systems. Maybe all of that is scandalous. Maybe all of that is business as usual. Did governments suddenly get corrupt? Well, if the use of deceptive stories like the Santa Claus story is an example of corruption, then is government even any more corrupt than any other category of social organization? Did politicians begin lying just recently, or has that been going on for a while? Thousands of years ago, did humans commonly enslave other humans, like in Egypt or Greece? You could name a type of corruption, and I could name cases of that type of so-called corruption that are hundreds or thousands of years old, right? Didn't early European imperialists like Columbus and Coronado and all the others massacre or enslave Native Americans? Were blankets that were infected with smallpox intentionally distributed to other Native Americans later as gifts? Churches and governments teach us what is corrupt or punishable and what is proper or rewarded. The Holy Roman Inquisition may have promoted the idea that murder is one of the 10 basic sins punishable by an eternity of torture in hell. But a short torture and public burning, maybe short like a few hours, a few days, a few weeks, I don't know, but, relatively short compared to an eternity in hell. A short torture and public burning was a primary practice of their system of ritual human sacrifice. However, now they are against abortion because it is allegedly evil to take a human life. Oh. So just as our parents defined to us what behavior is good, rewarded, or bad, punished, so do social institutions, like producing alcohol was legal at first, then criminalized by a constitutional amendment in the U.S., and now it is subsidized as an alternative to fossil fuel. Whether our parents used a deceptive fraud like the Santa Claus myth is really rather incidental. We all got rewarded and punished by our parents, right? whether they used fraudulent methods of bribery or just direct, explicit bribery is a secondary issue. Everybody was bribed by their parents. There could be exceptions to that, but they're pretty darn rare, I'm sure. So, whether governments use fraudulent PR or not is also incidental. Look at what the basics of government are. Not whether they use the fraudulent PR, but what are the basics of government? They redistribute wealth. They are operations of organized coercion. For instance, this is an incidental thing. It's not really important, but for instance, alcohol is now legal to sell to the public in the U.S. in most jurisdictions, but only if you first pay the government the $20,000 or whatever a license costs these days to have that license to legally sell alcohol. So it does not really matter why. It doesn't really matter if there's a Santa Claus myth or if there's a complex whatever myth. Look, if you break the rule and get caught, the government will probably punish you. Also, if you have a great lawyer that you can pay $10,000 to defend you, then the government will probably punish you less, if at all. Okay? That's why? That's how it works. It's called government. All right. So whose rule is it that alcohol, which used to be immoral and used to be criminal, is now only legal to sell to the public if the government approves? Whose rule is it that alcohol is only legal to sell to the public if the government approves? That is their rule. The government's. They make up the rules and then enforce the rules on you, and they do not require your agreement. Just like Santa's definitions of good and bad behavior do not require your agreement. It's just about obedience. Yeah, but can't the people influence the government's rules? Of course. Try lobbying for the elimination of the government licensure of the public sale of alcohol. Go ahead. You might even win. So what? Yeah, but shouldn't I be personally responsible for fixing governments so that they are no longer corrupt? Who made up that rule? What are the effects of acting as if it is true? And carrying the burden of that guilt and shame and whatever. It's exhausting, isn't it? It's depressing. Oh, I should have fixed government by now. I've been trying for 14 days or 14 years or oh my God, I'm such a failure. I haven't fixed government yet. All right. Yeah, but shouldn't we eliminate the corrupt practices of bribing children and deceiving them? Rewarding them for obedience? Shouldn't I influence how other people discipline their children, like to defend the children from these evil, corrupt parents who promote things like obedience? Shouldn't I be responsible for fixing how other parents operate? Shouldn't I avoid bribing my children or deceiving them with stories of Santa Claus? If that is what you were taught by your parents, or your public school, or your church, or your media, or your government, then go ahead. You might even succeed. So what? Yeah, but those trustworthy people told me that it is okay to eat lots of candy, especially on Halloween, and best to eat lots of empty carbohydrates, and dangerous to eat things that nourish me. Now, I think it was inaccurate and maybe even intentionally deceptive. Aha, and so is this the first time that something inaccurate and intentionally deceptive has ever been presented to you, Santa? By the way, when you say that those people are trustworthy, are you sure that a more accurate term might be trusted? You trusted them. Then you found out that they lied and that they probably knew they were lying all along. They were never trustworthy. They were lying all along, whether or not they knew it. Right? Well, yeah, but the government people told us that if we ever noticed any corruption, then we should report it immediately to the government people, so that the government people could investigate the alleged corruption. Right, and then they would punish any unlicensed fraud as a threat to their monopoly on fraud. So what? Wait, are you saying that the government trained us to report ourselves to the government if we ever caught on to any instances of corruption? Like so they could better cover up their corruption and to make it easier for them to distinguish the half-wit people from the no-wit people? Well, I did read about that once in a book by George Orwell called 1984, about the government setting up programs by which they would attract half-witted people to distinguish themselves and report themselves to what ultimately was the government, who had set up these revolutionary and anti-government campaigns. But I am sure that those trustworthy people in all the governments of the world and throughout human history would never create a deception in which they protected their network of other deceptions by training half-witted people to report themselves to the government by campaigning earnestly for justice in regard to some isolated instance of deception or corruption or organized violence or fraud or governing. However, I will say that when I reported my parents for bribery and fraud in regard to their manipulative use of a fabricated story about Santa Claus to influence the behavior of myself and my sister when we were small children, my parents were acquitted by a jury of their peers. I was shocked. Then I realized that all the other people on the jury implemented the exact same methods of bribery and fraud on their own children. Anyway, if you want to go to some government people to report the methods of some other government people, go ahead. Government people love to justify their programs of coercive wealth distribution. That's coercive wealth redistribution, by occasionally spotlighting to justify their programs of coercive wealth redistribution. They love to do this by occasionally spotlighting an allegedly isolated case of government corruption and then condemning it harshly. They say things like this: government should not be corrupt. Oliver North should not have used bribery or fraud. By the way, this allegedly isolated case is obviously just an isolated case. That kind of sounded like Smithers from The Simpsons there. Did you notice that? All right. That makes for a dramatic scandal and attracts a big audience, which advertisers like. They spotlight this isolated case of government corruption and condemn it harshly. Ooh, Smithers loves it. It just makes his bones creak. So it makes for a big dramatic scandal and attracts a big audience, and advertisers love it. And then, when Oliver North is pardoned by the President of the United States on the last day of his administration, only a few people notice, because only a few people are awake. And they're all half-wits anyway. So the rest of the people are still celebrating that governments protect people from corruption and all things that are bad or evil or dangerous. Those celebrating people got so drunk with alcohol, of course purchased from a licensed seller of mind-numbing potions, that they were still passed out from intoxication when the pardon was announced. By the way, Santa Claus is a staunch opponent of bribery and deception and manipulation, which are dangerous, at least for those without proper licensure. That is why you will not get any presents if we catch you committing acts of bribery, deception, or manipulation. Now, consume all of your biochemical nutrients until your dish is empty, or else we will not give you any fix for your addiction to refined carbohydrates, which would mean that you are good, as in obedient, as in valuable to us, if we did provide you with that fix for that addiction that we have cultivated. Governments protect us from corruption and organized violence by using organized violence and corruption Churches protect us from things like the psychological torture of an eternal hell by psychologically torturing us with threats of an eternal hell. The media protects us from paying attention to anything besides whatever they are broadcasting. Finally, Santa Claus protects us from accepting gifts from strangers.